Great. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us. John Scanlon, I'll be your moderator today. We have a fantastic lineup. We're going to be talking about stolen wildlife, legal trade in illegally sourced species. May sound a little bit peculiar, but the reality is that there are millions of species that are not protected under international law that find themselves into illegal trade. But because destination countries don't recognise them because they're not protected under international law, they ended up getting legally traded into the destination state. We're going to hear a lot more about that in a moment. I would, however, like to recognise all of our sponsoring institutions here. Firstly, Born Free. Born Free, thank you, because I think you submitted this formally. Mark Jones down there from Born Free, great to see you. End Wildlife Crime and International Council of Environmental Law, Anna down there, and myself. Four Paws, I think we have Aubrey Collins. Yep, it's over here, great. No one from I4, they sent an apology. Pro Wildlife, we're going to hear from Sandra in a little while. And last but by no means least, the Wildlife Conservation Society, Alice Pasqualato, down there in the corner. So great to see you all, and thanks for supporting the event. I think all of the people that I've just mentioned could be on this panel as well. We have a deep expertise in the subject matter here. But we're very fortunate, I think, to have the person, Sandra Atler, who is the person that I think knows more about this subject than anyone else, has been really a force of nature in drawing attention to this issue of species that are not protected or listed under CITES or other international instruments, how they find their way into illegal trade, but it's not treated as illegal in the destination country. Sandra, I think we met each other about 14 years ago, while I was Secretary General of CITES, and Sandra was talking about these issues way back then. She is a biologist. She's worked on these issues for 30 years, and she's co-founder and board member of the German-based charity Pro Wildlife. Now, Sandra, you've produced this Stolen Wildlife series since 2014. But not only has Sandra produced this series, but she's also encouraged states to bring more species under CITES trade controls to avoid the problem that we talked about. She's been very successful at that. And the EU in 2023 commissioned a feasibility study on criminalisation of illegally sourced wildlife, which was published last summer. And that confirmed the problem that stolen wildlife has been exposing for a very long time. So we're extremely fortunate, I think, to have the world's leading expert on this particular subject in Sandra, and I will pass the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind words. Yeah, well, let's deep into the... Does it work? Not yet. Here we go. Okay. So, as it was already introduced, the topic of my presentation is stolen wildlife, which is on species which are not protected under CITES, but nevertheless protected under national law in the country of origin. And as soon as these animals are smuggled out of the country, they can be legally sold in almost all countries in the world. So let's start with what is wildlife crime? I think that's undoubted a main threat to global biodiversity, but it's often not handled as a serious offense. It's not a priority in many countries. It's limited, which leads to limited enforcement capacities, prosecutions are rare, and penalties are low. Wildlife crime, if you talk to people on the street or with media, so it's understood as poaching of elephants, tigers, pangolins, etc. So on the megafauna. But wildlife crime is not at all limited to this megafauna, and it's not at all limited to species protected under CITES. But it's increasingly targeting non-CITES species protected in their country of origin. And the simple reason for that is that the risk, the legal risk for the smugglers is so much smaller, while the profit is very high. So this type of wildlife crime enables traders to legally sell illegally sourced non-CITES animals with a large profit range and low risks. it targets very rare species. So we don't talk about smuggling of millions of individuals, but of very rare species, which means that even the offtake of hundreds or thousands of these animals may have a serious impact to biodiversity. This wildlife crime tolerates and even rewards a highly criminal business. And I'm still hiding with this. And it undermines the national conservation efforts in many parts of the world as the countries of origin try to protect their native species. This is a figure of our report, and I started too quickly. I first of all want to thank my co-authors, because it's nice what John said, but I'm not at all the sole author. So I had fantastic colleagues from I4Paws, WCS, and the Humane World for Animals, and thanks for this great cooperation. So this figure is showing that it's a global problem. We focused on the European Union as a destination because we are one of the top markets for exotic pet trade, but of course this problem could also be for any other region. What it shows is that animals from all over the world are stolen for this business. For today, I chose two examples, one from the exotic pet trade and the other one will be on insect collections. So my example from the pet trade is the giant bronze gecko, which is endemic to the Seychelles, and it's critically endangered. And the only place where you find this animal in nature is the Presley National Park, a size of 4 square kilometers. That's the only place where this animal lives. And nevertheless, we found this species for the first time a couple of years ago in Hamm, which is the largest reptile show in Europe. And it was praised as the new Ferrari of the hobby, and it was offered for 5,000 euro per gecko. So you see the huge profit which can be made in this business. And the Seychelles were not even aware. They thought their animal is protected. As an emergency step, they listed the species at CITES Appendix 3, which means they don't need to ask the other parties. But we hope that a stronger protection measure will follow in the future. Then we have this Macedonian grayling, a butterfly from North Macedonia. It's point endemic to a small village and the fields around, 10 square kilometers. It's also critically endangered. It's also strictly protected at national level, and you can find it in the international insect collection trade. And there's an ongoing illegal capture to satisfy the demand of insect collectors. And the craziest thing is, I spoke to an expert and he said, this is one of the most ugliest butterflies in the world, but people don't care. It's the rarity which makes it sexy. I shortly want to mention the typical career of guys in this business. So last year in February, the Mexican authorities found suitcases at the airport with 120 reptiles and some frogs. And they had an idea who tried to smuggle them, but they couldn't catch the guy at that time. A few months later, they caught the guy, and this time they found in his luggage almost 300 rare reptiles, and he was arrested. And this Gustavo A is, for us, a well-known smuggler since ages. So he was arrested in New Zealand in 2010, in Ecuador for stealing Galapagos iguanas in 2015. He had raids in his flat in Madrid, so he lived part-time in Mexico, part-time in Spain, which enabled him to sell to all over Europe. And you see, he has a long career, which means that the minor penalties he experienced had no deterrent effect. So we hope this time that this case will be seen as a transnational organized crime and not just as a minor offense. Yeah, as this was already mentioned, so I can go through this. The good thing is that in the meantime, Europol and the World Wildlife Crime also warn against this particular form of wildlife crime, and they confirm that this is an increasing trend because of the low penalties. And this was already mentioned by John. The EU is currently discussing whether or not to close its legal loopholes, and we hope that the study, which was published last year, helps to go forward with the legislation. So, what can states do to prevent and combat this issue? First of all, wildlife crime must not be treated as a serious threat, or it must be seen as a serious threat to global biodiversity and not as a minor offense. States should advocate for, and this is why I'm here today, to call on states to support the adoption of a new protocol under UNCLOS covering wildlife trafficking, and support that the potential new protocol criminalizes the import of any wildlife if it was acquired in violation of the laws in the country of origin. And of course, as an EU citizen, my focus is on the EU legislation, and I really hope that the EU, with the new study published, will implement a new legislation to criminalize the trade in the illegally sourced non-CITES wildlife. And that was my part, and I think we hear other very interesting information from my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandra. That was wonderful, and a very clear explanation of the work you've done and the importance of it. I think one of the points of principle, and this is one of the issues that has been raised in the discussion of a protocol, is that if a country, a source country, has decided that it wants to protect its wildlife and it has decided how it wants to exploit its wildlife, then that should be respected by other countries. It's a principle of comity, that you respect the laws of one another. And at the moment, a source country can protect its wildlife, but because it's not listed under CITES, a destination country can let it in legally. And that's disrespectful to the source country, which should have control over its own natural resources, which is part of international law. So one of the things that's been talked about with a protocol is that a protocol would oblige states to criminalize the import of any wildlife that was acquired in contravention of the laws of the source country. And you could actually apply that to any natural resource, because it's not okay to steal wildlife or natural resources from a source country simply because it's not recognized in international law. So it's a very important body of work you've been doing. Now, I'd also like to acknowledge one person. I noticed while you were speaking that we have the Ambassador Faranisi from Zimbabwe with us. And Ambassador, it's a great honor to have you with us. Thank you. It's a very important subject, and we're delighted that you and your team are here. Now, we're going to move to our second speaker, Emma Håkansson. I've known Sandra for about 14 years. Emma and I have known each other for about 5 hours. She just arrived from Copenhagen today, and we've met for the first time. I'm really excited to hear from Emma because she's going to bring to our attention something that I've not heard discussed in a CPC side event. She's going to talk about case studies on the use of wildlife products for the fashion and luxury sectors. Now, she's extremely well placed to do this because she's the founding director of an organization called Collective Fashion Justice. It's in the wrong order here. Go with my statement, Collective Fashion Justice. Now, this is a charity working to protect people, animals, and the planet through fashion. They do a lot of research and investigative and policy work, including efforts to shift fashion beyond harmful wildlife exploitation. And they have been involved in events across New York, London, Copenhagen, and Milan in relation to all manner of issues. So we're very much looking forward to what you have to say today, Emma, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for having me here. I'm really pleased to be able to bring fashion into this sphere where it's not spoken about enough, despite the fact that, as you'll soon see, it's very relevant. So, we're talking about the illegal trade and legal trade of live wild animals. A lot of the discussion today is about pet trade, where animals are alive. It's a much more complex issue when it comes to tracing animals when they're traded in the form of a bag or a pair of shoes. That makes the fashion industry particularly high risk for this kind of trade. Ooh, having the same issue as Sandra. So in the fashion industry, we see non-CITES species who are nationally protected, like this Vancouver Island marmot. They are traded in the fashion industry outside of where they come from. But we also see species where they are CITES listed. This Cayman crocodile is one example. It's completely legal to trade this species in some contexts when they come from certain parts of the world where they're farmed, but then if they come from other parts of the world, it's completely illegal. And there's often enormous issues that come with the fact that we don't know where the Cayman skins came from, so we don't know if it was legal or not. This is just one of the ways in which the line between legal and illegal wildlife trade in fashion is really murky. Part of this is because in order to make an animal into a shoe, into a bag, into a jacket, those skins would rot on our feet or on our bodies if we didn't tan them, if we don't put them through a very chemically intensive process that also destroys most of the DNA that's involved, that changes what they look like. So it's kind of the dream for someone who wants to take an animal and illegally trade them. Some of this will be kind of improved by the European Commission introducing the EU Digital Product Passport Regulation. This will mean that companies over a certain size are going to have to trace the entire supply chain. So we'll know where the raw material came from, which means we'll know, for example, with that Cayman crocodile, did they come from a country in which they are legally traded or not? But this is not going to help in all kinds of wildlife trade because we have a huge problem with laundering, particularly when it comes to reptile skins. So there are a number of different python skins that are legally traded. Indonesia, Malaysia are two countries where this is happening a lot, and we have farms for these snake skins. But those farms are often being used to launder wild captured snakes as well. And so again, the species is the same, but we're going over the quota of snakes that are permitted to be taken from the wild, or we're being told that they're farmed and captive bred snakes, but they're not. This again can include CITES listed species where they're legal to trade within that context, but we also see the killing of snakes that are juvenile and so therefore further impacts the wild population. The same is true for if we have snakes that are captured when they're with eggs, and so again, of course, the population is particularly negatively impacted by that. Again, this trade is extremely difficult to deal with in fashion. This bag is red. The species that this bag comes from, we don't know what it is. It's listed as a python species, and in order for this product to be red like this, it needed to have the skin be bleached to an almost white product, and then it was dyed a different color. So a lot of the conventional markers of what that species looked like that could help us with identification are completely gone now. And so we're reliant on an industry that is not going to give us that level of specificity in labeling unless they're forced to, and they're not really. We also know that relying on CITES listing for wildlife protection in fashion is not enough. First, because we know that the process of listing can take a long time. It can often drag far behind national legislation, which is normally more up to date with the reality of the endangerment that a specific species might be facing, but also because of issues of conflicts of interest that the fashion industry are deeply involved with. The fashion industry works hard to corrupt the legitimacy of some of the work at groups like the IUCN, where specialist groups that we know have significant power related to decision making in regards to CITES listing of species become involved with the fashion industry and those that profit from whether or not those species can be legally traded. For example, earlier this year, Collective Fashion Justice published an investigation that was in The Times and a lot of other publications that focused specifically on the crocodile specialist group and the snake specialist group of the IUCN. And it found that in these two groups, where of course transparency and independence from industry that trades these species should be really important so that we can have a purely scientific response to conservation. Instead, are often potentially being influenced by commercial interest. Both in the snake and the crocodile specialist groups, we know that there are significant financial ties to the luxury fashion sector that profits from the sale of crocodile and snake skins. And so, of course, this is going to impact potentially the findings of these groups. A little bit of a map of some of the issues here. The longtime chair, for example, of the crocodile specialist group was until recently also the owner of Australia's largest crocodile factory farm. That crocodile factory farm supplies Hermes, which is a really large luxury fashion group, and Hermes in turn funds the crocodile specialist group of the IUCN. So you can see where the problem is coming. He has been replaced by someone who also works under him at the same crocodile factory farm operation, and it's the same people who were responsible for lobbying to change the appendix listing of the saltwater crocodile to permit them to be factory farmed and traded in the first place, when previously this was not the case. Similarly, and this is the Times headline from earlier in the year, the chair of the snake specialist group has a publicly listed and lucrative partnership between the luxury fashion group LVMH, which is run by one of the richest men in the world, and his own organization. LVMH is also one of the largest purchasers of snake skins in the entire world. In our investigation, we spoke to conservation scientists who are a part of specialist groups of the IUCN. These specialist groups are extremely important, and there's a lot of people doing fantastic work in them. We know that people have put forward data suggesting that certain snake and lizard species should be added to CITES or listed differently. The red tegu lizard was one of these, who is still not as protected as these conservation experts believe they should be, because instead these experts were removed from the group. So the trade influence that the fashion industry is perpetuating is extremely problematic and only strengthens the need for the EU to not rely exclusively on CITES listing, but to respect national legislation where people want to protect their wildlife. To talk in the EU context, if we're to speak about the true scale of illegal wildlife trade for fashion that is occurring, it's really hard because we don't have the data, because reporting is weak in comparison to somewhere like the United States, where they have the Lacey Act, where illegal wildlife trade is criminalised, and so as a result, there are more seizures. We have a higher rate of reporting that is done properly. A lot of the fashion brands, though, that are associated with these seizures in the US also are European companies, or they sell into the EU. So if we look at the US, we can understand the EU context a bit better. One of the highest profile cases was this celebrity designer, Nancy Gonzalez. Her handbags were featured in The Devil Wears Prada, Sex and the City, Britney Spears has worn them, Victoria Beckham has worn them. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison because most of those bags were from illegally imported wild animal skins. Between 2016 and 2022, some 200 shipments of reptile skins were seized at the US border, and most of these were linked to large luxury houses that are mostly European owned. So these are just some brand examples. All of these have been linked to illegal wildlife trade, and this trade is also happening on the European market. We just don't have the same enforcement in place to deal with it. We also know from US data that has been reviewed that the fashion industry remains the largest importer of illegal wildlife products to the USA. The weakness of US versus EU dealings with this problem can be shown through Vestiaire Collective, which is a reseller of luxury fashion. It's a European company. Luxury fashion is often bought as an investment for resale, and European company Vestiaire is often forced to reject or cancel sales of these vintage and secondhand products because they include furs and skins that under the Lacey Act violate foreign conservation laws, whereas in Europe we don't really care. For example, some marmot furs, again, come from CITES listed species, others don't, but they're still nationally protected. On Vestiaire Collective, you can see there's over 1,000 different marmot fur products being sold. They're all just listed as marmot, though. We have no idea which particular species we're talking about. Another high-risk, non-CITES listed species group that is illegally traded in the EU are stingrays. Stingray skin or leather is sold as shagreen or galuchat, depending on where in the EU you are. And again, Some stingray species are CITES listed, many are not, and a lot of stingrays are considered data deficient at the IUCN Red List level, and so they're kind of out of the scope of CITES oversight, despite, again, national level protection. That means something like the Ganges stingray, which is protected in India, but not CITES listed, is often smuggled into tanneries in Thailand and Indonesia, mixed up with legally traded stingray skins, and then just sold under the generic stingray name. European companies often don't even use the word stingray, they use shagreen, and a lot of people don't even know what that is. We're talking about Cartier, Hublot, Chopard, a lot of luxury European watch companies. And stingrays are a really important species to talk about because we know that they're already vulnerable because they're very slow to mature. They're already being impacted by bycatch by the fishing industry, let alone the direct threat of poaching for their skins. The global trade of supposedly legal wild animal skins is valued at about US $1 billion annually, but when you look at the markup where skins are sold for much more in the form of a bag, it can be about 6.3 billion US dollars. We don't know exactly what portion of this legal trade is actually illegal or not because we don't have this framework yet to deal with it, but the cost is likely significant. We also know that the fashion industry simply does not change unless it is forced. There are a lot of examples where EU regulation has really quickly forced the fashion industry to make legitimate progress, and so this is another instance where we need this regulation or illegal wildlife trade will just continue in fashion. It is for this reason that Collective Fashion Justice is extremely supportive of the proposal to criminalise the import of illegally sourced wildlife into the EU. And when we talk about this as a potential to luxury fashion brands, even just the risk of this occurring is really motivating to them looking at their supply chains more seriously. And that is all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. There's a lot of food for thought there, and you've obviously put significant effort into the work that you've been doing. Can I just check, is everyone familiar with the Lacey Act? Because Emma referred to the Lacey Act. It's an act in the United States, and I think it's very much what Sandra's been referring to as well. And that's agnostic in terms of whether or not a species is CITES listed or not. So within the US, you can't import any wildlife into the US if it was illegally sourced. It'll be a criminal offence in the United States to do so. It's one of just a few countries that do that. In most countries, as we've heard, if it's not protected or listed under CITES, it doesn't matter if it was illegally sourced, it'll be let through customs, which is a problem. And I think the recurring theme between Sandra and Emma here is that it doesn't matter. If the country of origin wants to protect it, that must be respected in other countries and not allow illegally sourced wildlife in. So that's fantastic. We've got, and we're now going to move to another part of today's event before we open it up for question and answer. Oh, and actually, Tanya, it's good that you're here because this use of lawful outlets to launder illegally sourced material, that's something you emphasised during your presentation earlier today. So maybe we can have a discussion about that in Q&A. But I'm delighted to say we've got two colleagues with us, Andre Koparek and Sheldon Jordan. Now, Andre, who's here, he and I only met about 4 hours ago as well, and we had a cup of coffee. He's here as chair of the Envy Crime Net, and that's a collection of European enforcement agencies, and he'll tell us a little bit more about that when he speaks. We also have Sheldon Jordan, who I've known possibly longer than I've known Sandra for many years. Sheldon is a veteran in this space in terms of dealing with combating and preventing wildlife trafficking. He's done many things. He's been in the field, so he's got his hands dirty in the field, including with working with customs. But he's also worked in a policy capacity in government as well, where he was trying to form policy. And I should say that's all been with the Canadian government. But he also worked with Interpol. He worked with Interpol in two roles, as chair of the Interpol Wildlife Crime Working Group. And also he was on secondment to Interpol in Lyon, France for a year or so. Now he's retired. He looks a bit young to retire, but he has retired. And he's retired from the Canadian government, but not from working on these issues. He's co-founder of the Canadian Environmental Crime Research Network, and he's also a special advisor to the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime. So welcome to you both. I've got a few questions. And Andre, I'm going to start with you because there's a lot of discussion here about CITES, and I gather you're all familiar with CITES, the treaty that regulates wildlife trade. Sometimes you hear people say that we don't need any international agreement on dealing with wildlife trafficking because we already have CITES. Now, we've just heard today about a lot of non-CITES listed species being unlawfully traded, etc. What's been your experience in terms of dealing with CITES and non-CITES listed species?
Yes. So maybe at the beginning I could introduce NVCrimeNet, which is a network of law enforcement authority in the EU, a neighboring country, focus on environmental crime investigation. So we were established 2011, 2024. We were formalized from informal network to non-profit international organization. And currently we are working in the platform of 4 networks, where are IMPEL, ENPE, and EUFIE, network of environmental inspectors, prosecutors, and judges protecting the environment. So it's a very fruitful tool for us. Regarding non-CITES species, it's quite a new topic for us. Of course, I've worked in this field since 2007. We focused mainly on CITES listed species. A few years ago, in 2023, we opened one investigation in Slovak Republic. And during this investigation, it was a huge network of criminals from Netherlands, Belgium, and United Kingdom. There was quite well-organized network, and these perpetrators, where they were discovered inside of these countries, decided to move to the east part of the European Union, where they suppose the law enforcement will be much weaker than in the West European countries. So they wanted to do this business from our countries. Their modus operandi was quite easy: to gather the species, specimens from a non-EU country, bring them to the EU, legalize them, put them on the legal documents and so on, and then legally sell them in the EU as a bred in captivity. So it was quite easy and so on, well, well understood. It took us months to discover all this kind of facility, because when you have a criminal network involved, these perpetrators already know how police and law enforcement works. So they usually focus on the activity, how to avoid the detections. So usually they don't own anything, they rent the premises and so on. So you cannot use data from registers. Usually they don't use the phone number registered on their names. They rent the car for transport, so you cannot use the license plates data in your highway system to track them and so on and so on. So they already were investigated so many times that they know from our investigation a lot. In this case, we were able to identify the facility where they kept all the species. They focused mostly on birds in this case. We conducted a huge searches of these premises. There were several premises like this, and we were very surprised because we counted that they will focus on CITES listed species. Unfortunately, beside of them, we found a huge amount non-CITES species. Just to give you some figures, there were 200 CITES listed species and 300 non-CITES specimens. So it was quite a huge number. And also we were quite surprised about the bad animal welfare condition. These birds, they were in a very poor and very bad health. The whole facility has to be in the quarantine for almost a month before we decided to move the birds outside of this. And we found in the fridge more than 100 birds, which were already dead and so on. So, and beside of this, there were also Slovak national protected birds, non-CITES birds. So we were able to investigate them. Also, we were able to open investigation also against the CITES listed species, but unfortunately we weren't able to open investigation because of non-CITES species, because it's not a crime in our country. So it shows us that this topic is here. It's not a problem only on environmental protection, because in EU we have a ban of import animal birds from non-EU countries. So this case showed us that for our perpetrators it's not an issue, and they are quite freely able to go through our borders because of corruptions, because of falsified documentation and so on.
Very interesting and very interesting practical example. And then Andre talked about bred in captivity, under CITES bred in captivity, if species bred in captivity, the rules that apply are different. And so there's often false claims of bred in captivity to get easier rules to comply with when it comes to CITES listed species. Sheldon, I'm going to come to you. You're Canadian and you're familiar with the Canadian system, and Canada has done something similar to the US when it comes to a Lacey Act and criminalizing import of species. What is your experience in relation to that act, and how do you draw on that experience when you come to an event like this and talk about a potential protocol and the benefits of it?
Thank you, John. The Canadian and American legal frameworks are similar when you look at them from a distance, but when you start getting into the nitty-gritty, the details, there's a lot of difference in implementation, and that can also serve some lessons. So in the US context, with this Lacey Act, you have the prohibition against wild species that were taken or transported elsewhere in the world, contrary to the laws of those other countries. Canada has the same prohibition. Where there is a difference is the regulations that allow for the importation. So, as you know, you've got your laws, but then you have regulations which determine what forms you need to fill out or what needs to be complied with to allow for the importation. In the case of the United States, they have a very robust regulatory framework where every importation and every exportation of wildlife, whether it is CITES controlled or not, has to be declared. It has to be written, the origin has to be identified, and the value. And so that gives you a little bit more information as a frontline officer in terms of determining is there compliance. Now, that still isn't very much information to determine was it taken legally or not from the country of origin, but it is a little bit more information. It's definitely not as much information as you would get in a CITES certificate, but that's not what we're talking about here. In the Canadian context, there is no documentation requirement for importation other than the regular customs forms, which means that you have a lot less information that you can try to determine if you have an infraction or something that happened in another country, which of course is problematic because if there was an infraction, it happened in the other country. How do we overcome this? Well, it's interesting because this has led to some divergence in the Canadian and the US context. Because of the US having a requirement for extra paperwork, they've also been able to generate a number of different cases where they're looking at, or where they've been able to identify products that have come from an illegal source in another country and been able to successfully prosecute them. In the Canadian experience, that's all but impossible. The law is essentially a scarecrow. And I know because I was responsible for administering the enforcement of it for a dozen years, which is challenging. Now, how do we overcome that? One way would be to, for example, bring in more regulatory requirements such as the US has, but even go further than what the US has and have a requirement for the declaration of compliant origin. So where the importer would have to declare that the goods were harvested or transformed legally in the countries that came from. In the case of, I don't believe we have Carlos Sanchez here at this one, but in the case of Peru, Peru is easy because everything that leaves Peru requires an export permit. It's very easy if you have something coming from Peru and there's no export permit, you know you have an infraction. Now let's just say that Canada or the United States or the EU or other countries were to put in a due diligence requirement to demonstrate compliant origin. Now, probably the first argument you're going to get against this is, oh, regulatory burden. This is going to be too difficult. Well, you know, if your polluting factory needs to demonstrate due diligence in avoiding spills or emissions, why can't your importer be required to demonstrate due diligence in terms of what they're importing to say that we did everything we could to make sure that this product was obtained legally before we brought it into our country. So yes, that is a bit more regulatory burden, but that's also a place where we can, for example, make use of new technologies, artificial intelligence. I'm working with some colleagues in the United States who have been testing with the Canadian Border Services Agency an AI system that helps customs officers in terms of identifying what the risk level is of certain wildlife products or wildlife origin products coming into the country. So yes, one solution is to increase regulatory burden, but given the technology and the tools that we have, there might be ways of minimizing that burden and optimizing the collective knowledge that we have in this place called the internet. So to sum up, Canada, US looks the same, but in implementation is very different because of the information that's being required at import.
Very interesting. That's a good distinction to make. And I think that's one that we may not all have been that familiar with, that you've been working with that in the field. I just want to come back to you, Andre, because Michelle in his answer also referred to what he saw as gaps in the system in Canada, notwithstanding they seem to have quite comprehensive legislation. There are gaps. European Union and European member states of the European Union, it's a different situation. You don't have that sort of legislation. What sort of gaps are you seeing at a EU level and at a national level?
Yes, in EU, we have, in 2008, we had the first anti-crime directive, which was replaced in 2024 by second anti-crime directive. And based on this, we are quite well prepared for investigation on CITES listed species. So it's quite well organized. But beside of this, there is a big gaps regarding the tools which we can use in this kind of investigation. We already know what are protected species, how we can protect them. We have a lot of knowledge about the modus operandi, about our perpetrators and so on. But unfortunately, we don't have sufficient tools. For example, you can catch smugglers with the shipment, the border, during the transport and so on, and you are able to make the investigation against him. Unfortunately, with the low sentence, you are not able to force him to tell you more about the organized crime group which is behind him. So usually the modus operandi of the perpetrators is always when you are caught, you just say you did it, you are sorry, you did a mistake, and you take it on yourself. And other stage of the organized group are well covered. You understand it's quite easy to replace a courier. So we can catch one, and next day they can have two others. So it's impossible to fight against this organized crime group as it is. So from our point of view, we need to have tools which will allow us to go much deeper, to not find only the courier, but also the final beneficiary who are behind this kind of crime. So from my point of view, this is the biggest gaps which we have. So if we want to speak about organized crime group, we should have tools which will help us to accuse also not only the lowest part, but the highest part of this group. So thank you.
And if you detect a non-CITES listed species, let's say it's reptiles, are you able to take any action if it would appear that they were illegally sourced? I mean, I guess you're not obliged to say whether it was sourced legally or not. Can you do anything in relation to non-CITES listed species?
Currently, mainly according our own legislations, we have something like a violation of the rules regarding the import to the country. It's a part of economic crime. We use it in many cases, which we already had when we didn't involve CITES species there, because beside of CITES, you have also veterinary rules. So all kind of import of this kind of animals has to be reported, has to be checked, inspected, and so on and so on. If somebody is doing it completely illegally, it avoids this system. And because of this, if the value of the shipment has it's over certain limit, we are authorized make this kind of investigation also. So, but it's not fully work. So, for example, in my country, we are working on a crime which should be implemented in our criminal law, which should allow us also to make investigation in all this illegal import of all the animals, also domestic animals, wild animals, and so on. So, if now we have some proposal in the government. So we hope it will go also to the parliament. When parliament will adopt it, we believe at the end of this year, we should be able also to penalize this. But it's not a rule in EU, in all EU. And we believe that the events like this will help us to highlight the importance of these articles.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to open it up for questions in a minute, but I know that Mark Jones, who's one of our co-sponsors, had a question he wanted to ask. I'm going to go to you, Mark, before I open it up to the broader audience.
Yeah, thank you very much, John, and thank you to the panelists and the co-sponsors of this important event, and to everyone for attending both in person and online. We're really honoured to be co-hosting this event. I think it's worth pointing out that this is one of a large number of events at the CCPCJ meeting focused on various aspects of crimes that affect wildlife and the environment. Emphasising just how far we've come in bringing environmental crime into the purview of the UNODC. And I'm very much looking forward to the UNTOC COP later this year, where I hope to see environmental crime and wildlife crime in particular front and centre of that agenda. My question to the panel is, how much of a game changer would it be for wildlife conservation and animal welfare, and for that matter, for enforcement authorities charged with tackling organised crime, if states were obliged through, say, a protocol under the UNTOC to criminalise the import of any species that were taken illegally from the country of origin, regardless of whether or not their CITES listed? Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. We'll go to Shell first and then come to Andre, and then open it up to Sandra and Emma as well.
Okay, I'm going to start at a very high level, at a policy level, because when you're looking at the importation of wildlife, you're usually looking at three different regulatory frameworks. One is around trade, so is the trade compliant? Two is around animal or phytosanitary health. And the third one is around invasives and conservation concerns. So right away, you've got three different frameworks. And quite often how it's organized within countries is that you're looking at each of these regulatory frameworks, not from a crime perspective, but you're looking at it from what could be the potential non-compliance damage to the environment. What are those harms? And so the indicators for those people are all around the environmental harms. What the mutant baby here is that because we've decided to regulate these things, this creates a new thing called crime, and it's a crime phenomenon, and it's normally not within the framework of what are these environmental harms. So chances are you don't have the focus going on to defeating, disrupting the crime phenomenon. So that's the very high level. Trying to put it into real concrete terms, I think one thing that a potential protocol would do would be to help enable the policy discussions within governments around, okay, how do we harmonize or take on this crime phenomenon in a way that it contributes more effectively to reducing these environmental risks while also reducing the non-compliance or the criminal aspects. So that's one. That I think is really important, is that we can't think of the two as separate, but we can't think of it as just one or the other either. I think secondly, we need to look at this also in terms of fighting the crime from all the different angles. In my former organization, we were responsible for the enforcement of the conservation law. We weren't the ones who could go after the financial flows that were generated by it. We could not go after the organized crime aspects which were done by police. So I think one thing that would be really valuable would be to open the discussion and updating our conservation laws and crime laws so that they're in the 21st century, because that's where the criminals are right now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Shell. I'll go to you, Andre, and then to Sandra and Emma, and then we'll open it up for further questions.
From our point of view as investigators, it's mostly important that this crime doesn't happen only in one country. It's fully international. So for us, it's very important to have all countries on almost on the same level of fight against this kind of crime. It doesn't make sense if we discover something in one country and we have all tools which we need for this kind of investigation. Unfortunately, the other country from the supply chain of this crime are not authorized, don't have specialized unit and so on and so on. So from our point of view, would be really if all countries will focus on this topic and set up the minimal standard which each country should apply. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. My big hope would be that if wildlife crime would be put on the same level as the smuggling of weapons or drugs, it would be a strong signal in terms of the penalties which would result. As I said in my presentation, at the moment, it's a minor offense in most cases, and it could lead to higher penalties and to a higher priority. And I'm based in Germany. We just had a case a couple of weeks ago when the smuggler of tens of thousands of birds to Europe got a penalty of just, I think it was 6,000 or 7,000 euros for this case, and he didn't even went to prison. And this is unbelievable when you look at the value of all the shipments he did, and this penalty is not at all ending up the story. So my big hope would be that this would change. Thank you.
Sandra.
I think this kind of protocol from a fashion industry perspective would also be extremely useful because, as you're saying, the kind of penalty that is happening at the moment, if you look to a multi-billion-dollar fashion company, is absolutely worthless, peanuts. And so to have it be taken more seriously, particularly in a time where the fashion industry, as with a lot of different industries, is under economic pressure. And so they're cutting their sustainability teams. Sustainability and ethics issues are becoming deprioritized massively. So unless legislation and a protocol like this forces them to take it seriously, they just are not at the moment. So it would be a massive game changer.
Thank you all for very interesting perspectives there around the same question. I'll open it up for questions more broadly. Yes, Justin?
Thanks. This is really interesting, and I think, in fairness, Sheldon has kind of just touched upon this, but it's just an observation that, and I'm looking at some of these enforcement actions and the legal solutions, but it seems you're currently looking at this through a wildlife lens rather than not just an organized crime lens, but also looking at other offences that might have been committed, not just the permitting either. But I'm thinking of this guy, Al Capone, who some people may have heard of, who was done for tax evasion. And I think in the CITES world has suffered from this as well for decades, that we look at this through a conservation or a wildlife lens, rather than what else can we do to do this. And I also just, and this is a question, like, has this been looked at? And like, is it worth looking at closer? But also, the other agencies that could be involved, the economic and financial investigation units, but also in terms of penalties. And again, we are suffering from this in other areas of environmental crime, but looking purely at fines or prison. And we really need to look at proceeds of crime legislation, because it seems that there's a lot of proceeds being gathered from these, and by taking those away and calculating how much has been earned illicitly and maybe cannot be explained, that could be used more powerfully. So I just wondered if any of you have come across sort of the use of that kind of measures, those kind of measures.
Probably a good one for Shell and Andre. Yep.
So once again, as you mentioned, thank you, Justin, for the observations, because they're all true. And it is a challenge, as I mentioned a moment ago, in terms of, going after the money. It's hard when, you've got a specialized regulatory agency that isn't enabled in law to go after that. We had an interesting case in the Canadian context about 10 years ago, where a individual who was convicted of smuggling 275 narwhal tusks, which are CITES listed, from Canada to the United States. In that case, the prosecutors elected to convict him on the wildlife charges in Canada. Then the U.S. extradited him to stand on money laundering charges. So, there's an opportunity to be inventive. Also, there have been other opportunities where, in the case of transnational crime, the prosecutors have elected to charge the person in the jurisdiction that had the stronger penalties. And we've had that between Canada and the United States. Canada's penalties are not bad, but they're not as harsh as in the United States. And looking for comparative value, the prosecutors on both sides felt that that was an appropriate solution. Now, one extra point on that is that between Canada and the United States, we have a very strong mutual legal assistance treaty, which allows for that kind of collaboration on environmental crime. Most other countries, we don't have that with, and most other countries don't have that with, which is one more reason why, for example, when you're looking at these prosecutions, having a global protocol, a global framework that could be activated as needed by the countries to share prosecutions, to share in extradition processes where you don't have an extradition treaty already, to be able to, where you feel appropriate under your laws, share intelligence and information intelligence would be a very powerful tool. Andre, in the European context,
we were just chatting because that was a very comprehensive answer. And what we're going to do is gather a few more questions, and then I'll give Andre an opportunity to pick up on that when we come, because we have Cesar from Brazil here who had a question. And then Alice, if you could grab a couple of questions online and be ready, and then we'll take all the questions together.
Thank you, John. It's a bit of food for thought, more than a question, but after the presentation by Emma, I was just reminded that today in the resolution we had at CCPCJ, which became General Assembly resolution, it's mentioned illicit trafficking in wild fauna and flora, including timber and timber products. Yeah. And I'm just thinking, so should we work on some kind of language to include derived products from wildlife, something to think on how we can do that, and it has to be a kind of simple way to do it, because otherwise it's more difficult to sell. And but I think it is one of the things we could consider, see if it fits. And just to mention, sometimes our discussion, the distinction between what's illicit trafficking and what is trade and regulation gets a bit blurred, right? I just have in mind the problem we still have, but in Brazil, we had a lot of gold being exported legally, because the companies could just declare, this gold comes from where I have a legal authorization to export it. Without fiscalization or some technology. Now the federal police is taking the print of identifying where money comes from. They have the technology for that, so you can say if that gold comes or not from that region, and that allows us to curb export, because you can identify where it comes from. So it's regulation, a mix of regulation and technology. It cannot be mere declaration. It's really a challenge. I'm sorry, it's not exactly a question, as I said, but feel free to refer to it or not if it fits in your specialty. Thank you.
No, excellent points. And I think it reinforces what Emma was saying, and then what Tanya was saying today about, whether it's timber or fashion products or gold, as you said, the laundering of illegally sourced through legal outlets is a problem. And the whole technology thing is very real. In terms of, we would, if the protocol is negotiated, we'd expect what wildlife trafficking is defined as to include parts, derivatives, et cetera, not just the raw product. So I think that could be covered through a negotiated outcome there. Alice, can you give us a couple of questions, and then I'll invite all panelists to respond to the questions that are coming, what Cesar said, and also what Justin said, but we'll do that to wrap it up. Yep, Alice?
Thank you, John. And first of all, many comments and questions complimenting the speakers for their presentations. So thank you again. There's many questions, so we won't be able to go through all of them, but just a couple. One from Joël Pepin Lenoir. They're asking, is there any documentation that Emma could provide about the CITES and non-CITES listed species in the fashion industry? Is there any publicly available data? Based on our knowledge of non-CITES listed species monitoring, probably not, but would love to hear your thoughts on that. And then I believe this is more for Sheldon. Georgie Jansen asks, from a very practical enforcement perspective, what do we do with all the populations that are already in the market? So those species that were, or the specimens that were illegally sourced but are already in people's homes. And he refers to criminalizing possession, but I think maybe you can clarify the fact that we're not talking about, in fact, criminalizing possession. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Alice, and thank you to everyone for joining us online and for comments, questions. I think the one from Joelle, I think you said, Emma, we'll put that one to you, and then I'll come to you, Shell, and then we'll come to the rest.
Yes. The first is, it is a bit of a patchwork of different investigations by NGO and civil society because it's not being done properly at a legal level, some academic works, but the patchwork has been put together. And so my email address and the Collective Fashion Justice Organization, people are very welcome to reach out and we can provide everything that we have.
Great, thank you very much. Shell, over to you.
In the Canadian law, it is prohibited to knowingly possess something that was illegally imported. But of course, proving the illegal import is a challenge in itself. But and Andre, perhaps your experience with illegally imported, whether it's CITES or not, is always a challenge for us in enforcement.
With that, I'm going to hand to Andre, and I invite him to make any observations on any of the questions heard from Justin, from Cesar.
Yes, I would like to react on the first question regarding the low sentence of the judges. We try to persuade them many times. We organize a lot of events at national level, but we understood it's almost impossible to persuade them. So we are looking for a way how to make it more how to say negative for perpetrators from our point of view. And we found out the best way how to do it in whole environmental crime is seized whatever you can seize. So according to criminal law, you can seize the illegal contraband, but you can seize also all tools which were used to commit a crime. So we started to seize cars, trucks, and everything. Sometimes the judge will decide that it will return, but usually after 3 or 5 years long investigation. So it's almost the same. It will be taken forever. So we decided as an investigator, unfortunately, we don't have a power to change the mind of the judge and give the stronger punishment. But as an investigator, we can seize whatever we think is necessary and then wait for the judgment in 5-10 years. Thank you.
That opens a whole nother discussion that we don't have time for. What I'm going to do is just invite, go down the line, Shell, Sandra, Andrea, and then Emma to say if you have 30 seconds, any final parting remarks, and then we'll wrap it up given the hour. Shell, starting with you.
All good.
All good? Sandra?
Yeah, I mean, in the ideal world.
Sandra, just grab the microphone there. Yeah. Yeah.
In an ideal world, it would not be just the import which would be sanctioned, but also the sale and the possession, which will be the problematic part. But the US Lacey Act, for example, also covers the possession and the sale of the animals. And that would be helpful because we have met traders at reptile shows. And when we said, well, this is not of illegal origin and this was stolen in its country of origin, they laugh at us and say, well, but it's not prohibited here. So sale would definitely need to be part of the package.
Yes, I would like to use one citation of Cesare Beccaria, one of the lawyer in the Renaissance, and he mentioned not the height of the sentence is crucial, but the probability of detection. So you can have a life sentence, but the probability of detection is 0. Nobody will be afraid. But you can have a small sentence, but if the probability of detection will be 100%, probably nobody will do it. So thank you.
I think I'd like to end by noting that when we talk about a protocol like this, something that Tanya said earlier also becomes important, where we need to think about legal personhood and how corporates can be taken seriously, and that there's not just the kind of scapegoat that is done through different structures, and that we see corporates and big fashion companies as facilitating and being a part of organized crime. So it's not just the person who actually imports it, but the company that is getting the lion's share of the benefit of that illegal trade.
Fabulous. That's a very good note to finish on. I'd like to express my thanks to Shell and Sandra and Andre and Emma. Excellent presentations, response to questions, really interesting insights. And I think we've seen some different perspectives today we haven't seen at a UN Crime Commission meeting before. So I really appreciate them, everyone. Thank you to everyone for joining us online and for your comments and questions. Thanks to all of our sponsors. Anna, are you waving at me or? Oh, no. Okay. I thought Anna was saying, attention, please. No. And thanks to all of our sponsors and co-sponsors, Anna and Alice for helping us down the back there. And thanks for all of you for joining us. So let's